So we're going to look at a passage. It's a very, very familiar parable of Jesus, known in popular terms as the parable of the prodigal son. Though I'll say something about that in a minute. So what would normally be read in a church would start in Luke 15, verse 11. So what is the main idea in the text? I think let's start there. What's the main idea in the text here? What's the big picture? What's the big picture? And there is one, actually. Now, again, we talk about context, don't we? Now, the danger with the parables is because they are what seem to be standalone stories, the temptation is to take the story out of the context. But there is a context there. So I think if we were looking at this...
Yeah. It's the lost sheep, the lost coin, and then the lost son.
Okay, yeah. All right, we're getting a bit closer here. So we see immediately that it's a set of three. But where's the context? Why did Jesus tell the story? Just have a look at Luke 15. Why did Jesus tell the story? Who was he telling the story to?
The tax collectors and sinners gathering around to hear him.
Yep, and?
Pharisees and teachers of the law.
Yeah. Carry on.
Grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them."
Verse 3, so he told, who did he tell?
All.
Pharisees.
And the scribes.
Pharisees and the scribes. Now that's really important. That's the context. So the context is Jesus is speaking. It's a response again. Jesus is responding to the grumbling of the Pharisees and the scribes. Okay, why? Because Jesus was a friend of sinners. The tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near, and they didn't like that. Now that's just a running sore, as it were, for the religious people throughout the Gospels. Okay, so just have a look at verse 3. What does it say? Verse 3, chapter 15.
Then Jesus told him this parable.
Okay, just hold it there. And then he tells the parable of the lost sheep. Okay, and then look at verse 8. Just read out verse 8.
Or suppose a woman has tapped.
Stop it there. Also, can you see it's linked? So what he's doing, he's told one story, but then he tells another. It's linked. Or suppose, do you see what I mean? It's not just, I'm going to tell you a story here. He tells one story, but then he continues. Here's another story. But then, have a look at verse 11. What does it say?
A certain man had two sons.
Jesus continues.
Jesus continues. Thank you very much. That's good. In the ESV, and he said. Can you see what I mean? So what you could say, actually, Jesus is making a point by telling one story with three parts to it. Who's he speaking to? He's speaking to the Pharisees. Why?
Because they were grumbling.
Because they were grumbling. Okay. So therefore, if that's the context, let's read through this, and we need to pick out why is Jesus telling this final story? And we're looking at the big picture, the big goal, and there is a key person in this story. There is a key person in this story. And it links to the context. Would someone like to read it out? Let's, any translation will do.
Which one we read? The prodigal son?
Prodigal son, yeah.
Verse 11.
Oh, by the way, let's just pause there. Now, I might not be a very good reader. Does the word prodigal appear in that story?
No.
It doesn't, does it?
Except in the heading.
except in the heading, which isn't the Bible text. Now that's different in the Psalms. In the Psalms, of course, it might say Psalm, as we're going to look, and then it will have some text. That's the Bible, but this isn't. Now headings, I don't know, have you ever followed a sign and it's led you in the wrong direction?
Yep.
Headings or signs, because that's what a heading is, it's a signpost, can be a good sign, it can be a bad sign. We normally call this the parable of the prodigal son. Actually, that word isn't there. So we ought to, that might alert us already. Because we come to this, if you've been to church for any length of time, you come to this with a set of expectations about what this story is about. For most people, what is this story about?
Prodigal son.
The prodigal, which one?
The one that ran away.
The one that ran away. What I think we're going to find is that's not the point of the story. Okay? Let's read through it. If someone could read it through out loud, please.
Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, settled for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired men have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick! Bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For the son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate."
Now let's just pause there. If this story was just about the younger son, you could end it there, couldn't you? Yeah? If this story was just about, and I have been guilty about this in the past, because I've used this, it's the typical evangelistic sermon. Yeah? You know, the prodigal goes off, lives it up, but look at the father, and God is just like that. And if that's the story, that's it. Do you see? But it's not the end of the story, is it? And so sometimes we come to Scripture with a set of expectations, and we just need to read a little bit more carefully. So that's not the end of the story. What happens next?
Meanwhile, the oldest son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. "Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has him back safe and sound." The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him." "My son," the father said, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.
Thank you. Full stop. End of the parable. Let's remind ourselves, what's the context? Who is Jesus speaking to?
The Pharisees and the scribes.
Yeah. Well, the tax collectors provoked this. He was speaking to the Pharisees. So he's speaking to people like you and me, religious insiders. Okay? He was speaking to the church, the Old Testament church. Okay? So then he tells 3 stories. This is the last one, the most substantive. What is the big message of this? Now there are lots of little messages there. Don't get me wrong, but there is a reason Jesus told this. Okay, we've already seen the context, who he was speaking to. So what's the goal in this text? What's Jesus saying?
Verse 32, it was fitting to celebrate.
Yeah?
Is it possible that he's commenting on the relationship towards the Father?
That is a byproduct of that. What's the celebration?
I mean, you have that in the previous
Yeah?
things as well, that, they were celebrating when they found the lost
Yeah?
lost coin, the lost sheep. There was always a celebration going on, so it's fitting to celebrate. And the celebration is that this your brother was dead and is alive, he was lost and is found.
Okay.
It says the last 2 parables pretty much repeated itself. In the second one, I tell you, there's rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. So these are the of the first 2 parables.
So that rejoicing, which is absolutely true. Who is he speaking to? Pharisees. Okay.
The older brother.
It's the older brother is the key. You would say, who's most like the Pharisees in this parable?
The older brother.
The older brother. What is he saying to the religious people?
He compares them with the old brother.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the older brother says, I've been slaving for you, so they are self-righteous. And then the older brother says to his father, this son of yours, well, it's his brother.
I know. Isn't it? That's a pointed thing, isn't it? This son of yours. So if we look at this properly, actually the key person, the truly lost son, is the older brother. The problem is, in churches, we often don't preach it like that, do we? In which case I would say why you could just finish at verse 24, but the passage doesn't go on. So you've got the parallel at the beginning with the Pharisees and then ending with the older brother. Actually, there's not a happy ending here, is there? Because the younger son, he repented. He was lost, but now he's... But what about the older brother? So you can see, if we look at this carefully, how might we preach on this? If we want to be true to the context and true to why Jesus told this, how might we preach about this?
I'd ask firstly, who are we preaching to?
Okay.
Because the message could be set up in 2 or 3 different formats.
Yeah.
Depending upon who we're speaking to.
You're right, absolutely.
Verse 29. Look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when the son compared himself, and I think he's speaking about Israelites here, to be walking with him, this whole time and trying to find righteousness through walking the law, and not seeing what Jesus came to do for them.
Yeah, there's no grace there in the older son, is there? The relationship with the father, there's no grace there. Stuart's right. If, in some ways, if you look at this, if you were preaching to the church, what would this say to the church?
Well, you would, I mean, if you were to set it up, and if I was to set it up, I would describe the Pharisees and the scribes back in the Old Testament, and maybe some struggles or some difficulties they were going through, the religious system that they had, the religious setup, their mindset, their religious mindset. That would kind of open up all three parables, actually. And then I like how there's celebration in each one.
They must have been so furious at that. Because what Jesus is saying is that they're ring fencing God's concern and God's love to the insider. And they're rejecting the sinner. They're rejecting the outsider. Okay.
It's just interesting that he starts with he first goes on, he makes it personal first with the parable of the sheep, because that's something they may be familiar with. Suppose one of you, and then he goes on to suppose a woman, expanding that understanding from, okay, this is personal, then bringing in another person, and then the third story he expands and he uses the type and shadow method almost.
It's very good storytelling, isn't it? Because all the crowd there, I mean, and actually I'll read through this in a minute, and we'll just look at a little bit of background, some information, as if we were looking at it through a commentary's eyes. But the power of the parable is that it gives an unexpected ending. It's this thing, isn't it? And it's the ending you would most not expect.
It's just very interesting within the last parable. I guess he drives the sword straight into the heart of the matter. He looks at the heart, that both of them hated the Father.
Do you know, that's absolutely right. Both of them were relating to their father incorrectly. Both of them were. Now, we don't normally see that, do we? We just concentrate on the younger son. The younger son, though, actually turns it around. So it's a happy ending for him. But it's the older son. And if Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees, then actually that issue with the older son is probably going to be key. That's the controlling focus of the story. Because Jesus is speaking, that's the problem. It's the older sons who are causing all the problem, who are moaning. So again, let's just think, we're speaking to a church. What problems sometimes do we have in churches?
Condemnation.
Condemnation. To whom? Judgment.
Those who are outside the church walls.
Yeah.
When the only people we should be judging are those who believe and are within.
Okay, let's just think, just keep it going.
It could be, let me just give you one example. It could be maybe a member of the church, a young girl falls pregnant within the church and she gets kicked out.
Yeah. There are all sorts of issues here. So what challenge is this to the church? Because sometimes we need to be honest enough to take the part and to recognise that we are the older brothers. We are the church of today. So we need to somehow, rather than identify... I was never a prodigal, so I can't identify with him. I can identify with the older brother, though. I really can. So how might you use this? We're being true to the context, true to the purpose why Jesus told us. How might we use this?
I would say, you can look at the three parables and say what is similar in each one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously it's the joy, it's the celebration that happens when somebody is dead, is alive, or somebody that was lost is found. And so how much more should we be excited when those that come into the church that we're now living are now living?
I agree with him because on the 3:1 says about losing something. Somebody lost something. Sheep, the coin, the son lost a lot of things. And then there is repentance that appears as well. And all those three stories, and there's joy.
I find in many churches around the world, we struggle catching God's love for the world. And we tend to look inward. It's the problem with the church, actually. In fact, I could say that without good leadership, the default position for most churches, humanly speaking, they will start looking inward. Yeah? What is it Jesus? He's looking out, isn't he? The celebration of all of these people, but we can celebrate, but actually, wait a minute. The response to those people in verses 1 and 2 from the Pharisees was what? Grumbling. Muttering. Or, and I've seen this in churches, maybe it's just in England, look at all these new people coming in. Look at them. We've been here all our lives. We have sacrificed for this church. We have given to this church. We're the ones who've kept this church going. And look at how they're dressed. Look at their attitude. Have you heard that before? Am I the only one who's heard that?
No.
Okay.
It's like a territorial rejection. I hear you saying, and I think about lions. Lion doesn't allow another lion to come and get pride. He killed them. And if the lion attack him, what he does? No, the lion that comes from outside, the target is the cubs. He wants to kill the cubs and the prime lion. Exterminate the generation.
We're not very good. Churches aren't very good at doing exactly what Jesus did, to seek and save the lost. I used to work in a church. I was an assistant then. And the pastor, put a big sign outside the church. It was on a busy road. This church is for sinners only. Well, honestly, the man went up and knocked at the parsonage door and was really offended. Church is for sinners only? You could talk about the spirit of the older brother. Where do we see the spirit of the older brother? Now, you could develop that in all sorts of ways, couldn't you? Because that's what Jesus is speaking about. This is the problem, it's the spirit of the older brother, who, incidentally, remains lost.
The one that thought was there, that he was the final one.
Yeah, that's right. And so often, of course, in many cases when we speak about this story, we just focus on who?
The younger brother.
The younger brother.
Can I just, something is, verse 10, but going back to it, in the same way, I tell you there is rejoicing, and we quickly read, in the presence of angels of God over one sinner who repents, but just looking at it again, in the same way I tell you there is rejoicing, take out in the presence of angels, saying, There is a rejoicing of God over one sinner who repents. It's God rejoicing. It's not the angels, it's God. It's the Father rejoicing in those who rejected him, those who hated him, coming back to him, coming back.
Well, there's repentance. So the rejoicing is over the fact that they've repented. That's the key. What was lost has been found. Now, for the Pharisees, once lost, always lost. The great unwashed out there.
Because I think the Pharisees, it was all about following the law, doing everything correctly. If this isn't done correctly, then you're not righteous anymore. So if you break one rule, it's over for you. In their eyes, there's no such thing as forgiveness. So, what Jesus did here was to open their hearts, the eyes of their hearts, and be like, you're looking with your human eyes, and you're seeing these laws with your human eyes. You're not seeing them with your heart eyes.
There are all sorts of ways you could look at this. But just focusing on the younger son, there is a message there, but that's not the reason Jesus told the story. So we need to be careful there. If we're to be absolutely faithful to God's word at this place, we have to realise it's not ultimately about the younger son. The younger son plays the role of the lost coin and the lost sheep. That's the role. But because the context is speaking to the Pharisees, that interaction with the older son is key.
But if your audience is an audience of lost sons, how do you approach would you choose?
Well, that would be slightly different. Tim Keller wrote a really great little book on this. And he says that both the older son and the younger son represent different ways of finding salvation. The first way, the younger son, is just to follow your heart, do whatever you want. That's how we're going to find life. That's how we're going to find fulfillment and fullness. The second way is through religion and morality and laws. It's the older son. Both ways are inadequate. The gospel of grace is the third way. So you could look at, if you're talking to younger sons, you could look at how people find satisfaction in, that's what the younger son is doing, but then on the other hand, people find satisfaction, they think the answer is religion, laws, morality, but none of which are right. Rather, we see the answer in the gospel of grace. Let's look at the Father's response. So, what would we want to call this parable then? Is the prodigal son a good title?
The lost sons.
The lost sons is probably better. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Not one, but two.
But two.
Father's love, is that the NIV suggestion?
Yeah.
That's the title.
Yeah.
But don't you think that this parable also reflects God's heart, Jesus' heart, in appealing for repentance? That he was trying to hope that the Pharisees would really see and repent. And so I think whether you're preaching to the older son's type of people or the younger son's type, is all the key point is repentance.
Yes. Yeah. But sometimes the people who find it hardest are the people who don't think they need to repent. And that was the older son's problem. And actually, as Stuart said, he betrays it in the end. His guard slips at the end, and he gets angry with his father. And actually, he shows that his relationship with his father is actually quite similar to the relationship the younger son has. So yes, you could do that, but it would be a question, if you were speaking to the church, you would be calling the church to repent. Because we are the older brothers.
I think it's like they're grumbling, this man receives sinners and eats with them.
Yes.
And it was a call for them to join in. Why don't you join me in receiving making friends with tax collectors and sinners? I mean, I think that was the invitation they had. And instead of seeing them as collaborators with the Romans or whatever else, as
Traitors.
as traitors or whatever, however they saw them, to see them as brothers was perhaps the invitation of this. And just as the Father was asking them to come in and eat at the party, come join the feast, that I'm throwing for your younger brother, come and perhaps it's an invitation to join them. Once going back to what you were saying about Tim Keller, 5 years ago I preached this sermon, or a sermon on this passage, to a group of about over 100 and maybe 150 homeless people mostly. But what Joanna, I think, was my translator. And some of our neighbors actually came and joined it and sat in the front row. And I was so amazed that at the end they actually stood up to accept the Lord and was saved. And but then a couple weeks later we went back and we saw our neighbor again, the parking attendant guy, and he was a Buddhist, or it's coming out of a Buddhist, even though he had prayed to receive Jesus that night. You asked him why wasn't he continuing in his faith, and he said it's too easy, right? His response was, the gospel is too easy. You have to do something, you have to work.
Yeah.
And so he was going, because in Buddhism that's how you're saved, is through your works. And so he said it's just, the forgiveness of the Father is just too easy, you have to do something, you have to work for it. And so he continued, even though there was that moment where he received God's grace, he quickly reverted back to his own efforts at saving himself through Buddhism.
So you've got to imagine you're listening to this as a Middle Eastern person. This is how they would have heard this. Okay. And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. When do you normally inherit?
When the person dies.
When the person dies. So what is the younger son saying to the father? I wish you were...
Drop dead, give me the money.
Yeah.
There would have been a sharp intake of breath there. This was not just an offence against the father. This was an offence against the community. Don't forget. In days gone by, there was very little privacy. So, and even now, communities will feel a sense of shame and dishonour collectively when something, maybe one person transgresses. So at this, it's horrific. Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. The word there, property, in the Greek is bios. Interesting Greek, which is life. It's more than just give me what's in the bank. Give me my share of the family life. Now don't forget, nowadays, of course, in the West, your wealth is often invested in the bank. But here, it's an agricultural community. Where is your wealth invested? It's found where?
Livestock, cattle, fields.
Livestock, fields, cattle. Therefore, for him to get his share of the property, he divided his property between them, 1/3 to the younger, 2/3 to the older. Effectively, the father would have had to sold stuff. This was a big thing. It wasn't just go to the cash point machine, the ATM, and draw out my share. It was a real division of the life of that family. That's a big thing, isn't it? Okay? And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of the country, who sent him into his fields to feed what?
Pigs.
Okay.
He's Jewish.
He's Jewish. Okay. So, collective revulsion here at that. That's how much this son has fallen. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he gave to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants." Now, what he's probably saying there, the father would have had a number of people working for him, the slaves, bondservants, who were part of the family unit. But the other people were hired servants. They worked for a wage. And there's a sense here, what the son is trying to do, he said, take me on not as one of the bondservants, because that means I would be living back in the family. Treat me as a hired hand. And there's a sense here, is the son trying to earn money to pay back his father? I'm not too sure. It's an interesting question there. And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, felt compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. Now, the way I describe it is this. You've seen pictures of the Queen of England, haven't you?
Yes.
Now, sometimes very important people, you don't see them run. Okay? It would be demeaning. That's true culturally. Sometimes in some cultures, wise people, older people, important people do not run. That would be seen as they wouldn't do that. You cannot imagine the Queen of England getting up in the morning, coming outside Buckingham Palace and hitching up her skirt and running for the bus. You wouldn't do that, would you? And so in this culture, the sense of this father running would be seen as disrespectful culturally. So that's, again, an indication of how much the father loves the son, that he's doing something actually countercultural. But there's another thing which some commentators think might be happening here. Maybe there was another reason. It says the father threw his arms around the son. You see, don't forget, who had the son insulted?
The community.
The community, as well as the father. So maybe he wasn't that safe.
Yeah.
Maybe he wasn't that safe. And maybe
The law said he had to be put to death.
Yeah.
Dishonored his father.
Yeah. So maybe, we can't be, but culturally it would certainly fit. The father is actually not just welcoming, he's protecting his son too. Incidentally, going back to the birth narratives, it said that Joseph took Mary to Bethlehem. There was no reason for that. There was no reason for Mary to go with Joseph, because it was Joseph who was signing on the dotted line. Apart from, maybe she wasn't safe. Why? People knew she was pregnant. They had not been married. So there was a sense there, right at the beginning, the birth narratives, maybe Joseph, it's better to have her with me. She might not be safe. Okay, anyway, let's just carry on. The father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let us eat and celebrate. For this son, my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found, and they began to celebrate. What the father is doing, he's giving the best robe. He's saying he's now a member of the family again. Now, wait a minute. There's an element of maths here. So the son had a third. that left the older son having 2/3. Okay. That's all been spent in wild living. If the son is welcomed back as a member of the family again, that's going to be split again, isn't he? So the older son loses out again. His share of the inheritance goes down. Which incidentally, this is something Tim Keller just hints at. The cost to these, there's always a cost in redemption. Yeah? There's a cost in redemption. And although the cost of redemption is not overt there are hints of that. That the older son actually takes a financial hit there in the redemption of the younger son. But praise God, we have the perfect older son. Who is the perfect older son? Jesus. Jesus is the perfect older son who celebrates with his father. He celebrates with his father that the prodigal is back, the younger son is back, and is willing to make that sacrifice. So it's interesting, isn't it, pursuing these lines of thought. And that's something you're going to need to perhaps read a book about. But that's the advantage, isn't it, of just reading some commentaries and reading some books. Let's just carry on a bit, because it is a great story. His older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him back safe and sound. But he was angry, get this, verse 29, and refused to go in. His father came out, and there's an absolute mark of disrespect here from the older son, which I think actually Stuart picked up on. The older son refuses to go in and expects his father to come outside. So actually, we see the disrespect of the younger son. We see the disrespect of the older son here too. The mask is slipping, isn't it? The mask is slipping. His father came out and entreated him. Again, the father didn't have to do that. That's an utter act of grace. That is demeaning to the father. For the father, actually we can imagine that in our culture, couldn't we? That is the father wouldn't normally, if the father was given respect, he wouldn't have to do that. But the father willingly does that. He willingly does that. He answered his father, look, these many years I have served you and I've never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. It's law, isn't it? There's no love there. There's no sense of willingly serving the father out of love. It's out of duty. It's out of obligation.
It's like a boss and
employee. Yeah. But when the son of yours came, who has devoured your son, and that's been marked out already, your son, it's not my brother, your son, you're probably with prostitutes, you kill the fattened calf for him. And he said to him, son, this is the father, you are always with me. All that is mine is yours. In other words, he said, I love you too. I love you too. This is how you're repaying it. It's not good, is it? I loved you. You're in my family. And yet you're rejecting that. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for your brother was dead and is alive, who was lost and is found. So there's a lot there, isn't there, which we wouldn't normally pick up because actually we're not part of that culture. And that's the advantage of perhaps doing a little bit of background reading, which you might get some of these things from commentaries and some books. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Now, just expound is that everything I have is yours. Could also mean, expounding again, the kingdom is yours. You have everything. But the attitude of the older son is he doesn't give it back to the father, he keeps it.
He doesn't realize he has it.
There are all sorts of things you can look at this. There are all sorts of things you can get out. But what I'm saying is the controlling expository principle here is the key is he's speaking to the Pharisees. He's speaking to the older brothers. That doesn't exclude mentioning the grace sound in the younger son, but if we're to be true to that passage, that's the reason Jesus spoke the passage, told the parable.
He's teaching something for the pastor.
He's speaking to the church of the day, the Old Testament church.
Speaking to his
So we've done that, we thought about that, and we've got a better understanding of what the text says, but then now we've got to put the message together. Well, we're not going to do that now, but these are the foundational principles, isn't it? What is the passage saying? We can perhaps see how the original people heard it, why Jesus told this, who he was talking to. We would then need to say, right, what does God want to say to us? Or to whatever context you're preaching into. Okay? A great book is Kenneth Bailey, Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, published by IVP Academic in the States. You can actually buy an electronic version of that. And he's done brilliant stuff on some of the birth narratives. And actually, these recent years has been pretty instrumental, because actually, if you look at the New International Version, where was... Now, I'll just show you the text in the ESV. If you come from a culture where people have nativity plays, yeah, and at Christmas all the children dress up and they take the part, and there's that famous phrase, "There's no room in the inn." Now, the New International, the latest version of the New International probably takes the correct line and doesn't translate that as inn, but there's no room in the guest house. And if you read, and each chapter is standalone, he looks at those and shows how inn was never the right word to use. It was guest house. And it's a marvellous, rich exposition of the Luke accounts of Jesus' birth. You know, we have nativity stories. The church did that, and there were all sorts of other proto-gospels which were around, which kind of filled in some of the gaps. And so, in some ways, the church has been influenced by other biblical sources. How many wise men were there?
We don't know.
We don't know. How many do we sing about?
3.
3.
Because of the 3 gifts.
Yeah. How did Mary get to Jerusalem? Riding on a
Donkey.
A pregnant lady, nearly term, is not going to ride on a donkey. But it doesn't say anything about donkey. What we're saying is,
Jerusalem wasn't in Bethlehem.
sorry, Bethlehem. It's Bethlehem. But sorry, that we look at these texts.
Go past Jerusalem to get to Bethlehem.
Sorry.
She had to go past
Yeah,
Jerusalem
yes.
to get to Bethlehem.
We look through familiar eyes, and we assume there are things there which aren't. So, there's all this debate, where was Jesus born? Well, Kenneth Bailey says probably, if as the latest version of the New International says there was no room in the guest room, in Middle Eastern times, you can read about this in the Old Testament too, you would have had a fairly simple house, and sometimes a guest room was tagged on the roof. Was it Elijah who lived on the roof? Yeah. Or it was tagged along on the side. Okay. But there was no room in the guest room. Where, therefore, was Jesus? Well, you've got to understand, inside a Middle Eastern house, it was divided into 2 sections. Probably the living quarters was on a raised area like this. Okay. What lived down here? If the family lived up there, what lived down there? Livestock. You still see that in cultures all around the world. And I've seen this, actually. And the thing which divides the 2 living areas is the manger. So when it says there was no room in the guest room, where was Jesus born? Well, probably in a normal house. Where was the manger? We think the manger is kept outside because that's where they kept animals, but they didn't. They kept animals inside, which was, and which is why this is interesting, because the nativity version is there's no room in the inn. Where's Jesus going to be born? So you've got Joseph knocking on the doors and no room. Wait a minute. A woman is just about to give birth. Could you imagine, even in our culture, turning a woman just about to give birth away? You can. Well, I can tell you something. It wouldn't happen even now in Middle Eastern culture, where the act of hospitality is a spiritual act. It's an act of worship. So a Palestinian even would have read the old, this idea of Jesus trying to get room and no room in the inn, no room. That would never have happened. It would never have happened. And actually looking at and if you read Kenneth Bailey, what I'm saying is it's Bible study. It's going to get you thinking. And when you read the nativity events, through those eyes, you think, yes, you actually see some of the background, and it could only have been written by someone who had in-depth knowledge of that culture. In other words, it wasn't a fabrication of the later church. This happened. And there are all sorts of hints in the narrative to show this happened.
It's interesting that they mention the census. Because if they mention the census of Rome, it's a noted historical fact.
Yeah.
So you'll be able to key in which year, possibly closest to the month, also with astronomy linking in about the time. Because you'll find different astronomers throughout the centuries.
I think there is a struggle because there were many census at those times. So I think the best guess was it 3 AD or was it 3 years before or 6 years before? So we're not quite certain. People will.
BC is what some say. I think it's 3 BC.
3 BC, yeah, 3 BC. But what I'm saying is that we look at the events and we see something which is absolutely rooted in history and in the culture. And sometimes we just need to step back and read the Bible without necessarily some of the baggage which we've laid on. Okay. Point is, when we exposit the text, we're going to have to do work. And that's where, a study Bible or commentary, you can get 1-volume commentaries as well, but it's just going to be helpful. We're going to mine more out of the text as we listen to what other people have read and thought. Okay? But that's a really, I love that book. It's a beautiful book. And you can get a digital version. Okay? So your assignment, don't forget, I would be thinking, what is the topic you're going to choose? That's what I think you need to be thinking about. What's your topic?